Well, welcome to another edition of Breaking Politics at the end of what has been a rather torrid week in politics. To bring us right up to date with what's been happening, we're joined by Michael Packey. He's the Political Bureau Chief for Fairfax Radio here at Parliament House. Michael, good morning.
G'day, Chris.
What's happening?
Well, today the Qantas fallout still continues following yesterday's disastrous half-year financial loss from the company. Politically, it still centres around this debate, should the Qantas Sale Act be changed, or should the company be offered some sort of a debt guarantee to get it through this period. Now, this morning we had Labor and their transport spokesman, Anthony Albanese, do a press conference a short time ago pushing for the debt guarantee to continue, for the government to offer the company a debt guarantee. Alan Joyce also did the media rounds and he seemed to be pushing for this as well. And he also urged the government and Labor to stop using Qantas as a political plaything and basically get behind the company. He's concerned about the government's favoured position of changes to the Qantas Sale Act, saying that this could then start having implication when it comes to foreign investment rules. Now, what also is happening here is that Tony Abbott has pretty much ruled out going for the debt guarantee option, and this is at odds with what his Treasurer, Joe Hockey, was saying last week. Joe Hockey last week did appear to be paving the way for a debt guarantee for Qantas, arguing that it was probably the best option for the company.
Yeah, so there appears to be some signs of tension within the government in the lead up to the budget on some of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. There definitely does appear to be that. There's no doubt that Joe Hockey, you would think, would be aggrieved by some of the comments that Tony Abbott made in Parliament yesterday, where he pretty much kiboshed this whole idea of offering Qantas a debt guarantee, saying that it would set a dangerous precedent and that other companies would then demand the same thing, and that the government would then probably be forced to offer other big business similar debt guarantees. But given that Joe Hockey last week was almost saying that this is the preferred option of the government, and the government was brought to this position kicking and screaming, you can't help but think there is some tension on that issue within government ranks, as well as some tension also within government ranks on the issue of paid parental leave.
Yeah, now it's sticking with Qantas. So the position is that Labor's in favour of the debt guarantee, but not changing the Qantas foreign ownership limits. The government, or Tony Abbott, is in favour of changing the foreign ownership, but not giving the debt guarantee. So the government's position, Tony Abbott's position, is to change the foreign ownership limits. But Labor's against it, Greens against it, and it seems that Clive Palmer's against it. So what chance is there of that ever happening? Well,
the only thing that could happen, and this is what we're hearing, is that the government will still keep the 49% foreign ownership cap, which is embedded in the Qantas Sale Act. And what they'll do is looking at easing other restrictions within the Act. And it appears that Labor may support the easing of other restrictions within the Qantas Sale Act. That could mean giving foreign airlines a greater stake, allowing them to take a greater stake in Qantas, but within that 49% limit, and also allowing maybe foreign companies, which aren't airlines, also to take a greater stake in the airline within that 49% limit. One thing we've got to keep in mind here, Chris, even though there is this 49% cap on Qantas when it comes to foreign ownership, at this point in time, 49% of Qantas isn't even foreign owned. So there is some wriggle room for Qantas to try and attract more foreign capital into the company. I think a little over 30% of Qantas is foreign owned so far.
This is quite a tricky political situation for the government, isn't it? On one hand, it wants to maintain a tough financial fiscal line. On the other hand, I mean, Qantas is such an icon, it'd be pretty politically dangerous to let it falter further.
Oh, look, absolutely. And there's absolutely no doubt that Tony Abbott and the government do not want to own these 5,000 job losses that Qantas has announced. So the government is in a bit of a bind in that it has to come up with some sort of solution to help the airline at least get through this period. Obviously, the $2 billion in cost savings that Qantas has announced probably does go toward somewhat convincing the government that Qantas is going through a fairly substantial period of reform. But it depends what sort of what it all is going to come down to is the level of help that the government is prepared to give Qantas, and trying to reach a bipartisan agreement with Labor on the issue. And that's why I think that what we'll probably see in the coming weeks is changes to the Qantas Sale Act, which will be palatable to Labor. So that will mean that Qantas still does remain in Australian hands, but these restrictions in other areas could be eased. And that probably will be enough to convince Labor to support those changes in Parliament.
Now, as you alluded to briefly just before, the other big political issue that's around at the moment is Tony Abbott's promised paid parental leave scheme. Yesterday in Parliament, in question time, he was very firm. He was sticking by that policy. But there is dissent within the government.
Yeah, look, there's a number of coalition senators and MPs that are starting to speak out against it, saying that while on one hand the government is talking about a tough budget and tightening the fiscal settings to try and rein in some spending, well then at the same time the government can't be seen to making these generous paid parental leave scheme. So what we've had now is some coalition MPs starting to come out and talk about their concerns with Tony Abbott's PPL. I suppose one of the most notable people to come out is the National Senator John Williams, who's said that he doesn't believe now is the right time for such a generous paid parental leave scheme to be imposed, given that it costs more than $5 billion. And we also saw that story in the Financial Review that suggests that the Commission of Audit is also warning the Prime Minister and the Cabinet against going down this path. I think this story is going to be playing out a little bit more, and potentially the government here is starting to soften us up, is starting to soften voters up ahead of the budget, maybe to make some changes to the paid parental leave scheme, allowing Tony Abbott to look strong on the issue, that he still wants it to go ahead, but then eventually Tony Abbott having to come to the realities that it isn't affordable at this stage, and they may have to make some changes to it, such as pushing it out even further or reducing the amount of money that when it kicks in.
So you think there is some wriggle room there for the government? Because I would have thought that yesterday, after Tony Abbott nailed his colours so firmly to the mast on this policy, that it would be fairly embarrassing for him to back down, to taper its introduction or lessen its generosity?
Well, look, that potentially is going to be the case. There's no doubt that that's the way that the opposition will be painting it, and has already started painting it as an embarrassment to Tony Abbott if he does make substantial changes to the PPL. But I do think that the government will use the budget and the tough budget to at least suggest that they've had to make some changes to it. Maybe they might keep the cap as it is. I think, what is it? It's capped at $75,000 in full pay for 6 months. But what they may end up deciding to do, instead of introducing it in 2015, they may decide to introduce it in 2018 or something like that. I think that that's probably going to be the most realistic outcome of it so far, which will allow Tony Abbott to save face to some extent, but at the same time, for him to actually say, well, we do have a tough budget, we still are committed to it, but we can't implement it by 2015.
And Michael, Parliament isn't sitting today, so where are the leaders and what are they up to?
Okay, well, Parliament, as you say, isn't sitting today. Tony Abbott is in Darwin today. He's there with Scott Morrison. We believe there will be an announcement within the next half hour or so. It's got to do with Operation Sovereign Borders. They're not telling us exactly what the announcement will be, but we do know that it'll be around that. So, and the other thing is Bill Shorten. He's in Sydney today. He's got meetings all day. I'm not sure that he'll do any media today. I assume that Bill Shorten won't be wanting to face any questions about what one of his former colleagues has had to say in the papers today. Martin Ferguson delivering a speech in Perth later this afternoon, basically endorsing some of Tony Abbott's industrial relations planks, saying that that Labor should consider the reintroduction of the Building Commission, the building watchdog, and seriously consider some of the industrial relations reforms that that the Abbott government is proposing.
Sounds like both leaders are having a bit of trouble keeping the troops in line.
Absolutely.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for your insights today.
No problem.
And as Michael has briefed us there, a couple of the big issues of the day of Qantas. What will the government do? What can the government do to help? Also the issue of the paid parental leave scheme, Tony Abbott's own pet scheme that some people within his own government think is too generous. The other issue that's played long and loud in Canberra this week has been Labor's pursuit of the Assistant Health Minister, Senator Fiona Nash, and her former Chief of Staff, his links to the junk food industry. So I covered these issues with two of our regular contributors here, the Liberal Party's Wyatt Roy, who's the member for Longman in Queensland, and Labor's Amanda Rishworth, the Labor member for Kingston in South Australia. Let's hear what they had to say, starting first with Wyatt Roy. We're now joined by the Liberal Member of Parliament, Wyatt Roy, who joins us now. Wyatt, Qantas, does it deserve government assistance? And if so, what sort of assistance?
Well, I don't think it's the role of government to pick which companies should rise and fall. I think it is the role of government to create an environment in which all companies can thrive, they can prosper, and they can compete with each other. So I think Qantas is calling in part for a level playing field, and I believe personally that we should do that by removing the foreign ownership cap within the Qantas Sales Act so that they can compete for foreign investment with Virgin, because one of the clear realities is the big winners out of the battle between Virgin and Qantas has been the consumer. They've had a better product, they've had lower prices for their flights, and people have liked the product that Virgin provides and wanted to invest in that, and people can't invest in Qantas in the same way. So should we give them that level playing field? I think that's a good thing. And the other point that I would make is that we need to provide whatever means possible to create an environment in which those companies can run effectively and can prosper. So that means lower taxation and lower regulation. And I note in terms of Qantas, $106 million carbon tax bill a year would be making a very big difference to their bottom line and their ability to keep employing the staff that they do. So we need to remove those taxes and regulations so that they can compete in a prosperous sort of environment, and we need to give them a level playing field with their competitors. But ultimately, the consumer is the person that has won because there is competition in this marketplace.
Labor is opposed to lifting the foreign ownership cap. However, it is amenable, it appears to be, for the government to extend some sort of guarantor on the airline's borrowings. What's wrong with that idea, as it would immediately get bipartisan support?
Well, because you would be giving a distinct advantage to one airline over the other. We don't offer that guarantee to other airlines, and perhaps if we wanted to provide that to all airlines, maybe that's a different argument. But as I said, the consumer has won. Let's be honest about this. Virgin does a very good job, I think. They provide a great product, and they ensure, because of competition, that we have lower prices for flights. And to say that we're going to give a big advantage to Qantas and not to Virgin or any other airline is something that I think ultimately the consumer would lose out on. So I think Qantas has called for a level of the playing field when it comes to foreign investment, and I feel quite comfortable with that. If Qantas is a good airline and provides a good product, then people will want to invest in it in the same way that they invest in Virgin. And I think that that is a far more responsible approach than effectively giving one airline an advantage over the other.
You've mentioned a couple of times there this idea of the government providing a level playing field, but the reality is in international aviation, at least, there's no such thing as a level playing field, and it's certainly beyond the gift of the Australian government or any individual national government to level that playing field, because there's government negotiated flight paths, there's government-owned airlines, Virgin itself has had capital injections from government-owned airlines. Isn't the reality other governments are sticking up for their own national carriers, and that the Australian government should extend loan guarantees, etc., to help our national carrier?
Well, the reality is that Qantas has a ball and chain attached to it that other airlines don't when it comes to that foreign investment. And if they want to open that cap so that other companies, other people around the world can invest in Qantas, I think that's a completely fair thing to do, because Virgin isn't in a situation where it's allowed to do that. They provide a good product and people want to do that, where regardless of how good of the product or the opportunity that Qantas provides, people are not allowed to invest in it so that they can continue to provide a good service and grow. So in terms of the foreign ownership cap, I think it's important that we do level the playing field rather than picking winners out of that situation. And as I said, the other point that we can do as a national government, regardless of international circumstances, is create an environment in the Australian economy that is as competitive as it can possibly be with our international competitors. So we need to, as I said, lower the tax burden. That's, things like Qantas has to pay $106 million in carbon tax bill that foreign airlines wouldn't have to pay operating out of other jurisdictions. So that's an immediate thing that the Australian government can do, is to level the playing field again with international competitors, is to remove these taxes that they don't have in other jurisdictions. So $106 million on the bottom line would make a big difference to Qantas.
Now, you say that it would be a good thing to raise or get rid of that foreign ownership limit. Whatever the merits of that proposal, it seems difficult to get that through Parliament, because the Labor and the Greens are opposed to it, but also Clive Palmer, who's likely to hold some sort of balance of power position in the new Senate. If you can't get that change to the Sale Act through the Senate, is the government willing to wear Qantas deteriorating further without any sort of government assistance?
Well, I think we need to have a very strong discussion, not just us as the government, but Qantas themselves, with all people involved in politics. And I think Alan Joyce has been saying that he will do that. The Labor Party has a bit of a habit of supporting bad policy. As I said, they're supporting a tax that adds $106 million to the bottom line of Qantas, makes it harder for them to compete, harder to employ people. Qantas themselves are calling for the removal of this cap, and the Labor Party says in order to save Qantas, we have to do the opposite of what they're saying we need to do. We need to have a serious discussion with the Labor Party and whatever the makeup of the new Senate is, and see where we are through those negotiations. I would hope that good public policy would prevail at the end of the day, and ultimately the winners will be the employees of Qantas and the Australian consumer.
If we can change now subject to the paid parental leave scheme, clearly there are some members in the coalition, particularly some of your National Party colleagues, who are not happy with the level of generosity involved in the paid parental scheme. You were in the House yesterday, you heard how wedded to the idea the Prime Minister is. Is there some sort of compromise possible here, some sort of staggered introduction of the scheme, perhaps a less generous scheme? What are your thoughts on that, Wyatt?
Well, I'm a very big supporter of the paid parental leave scheme. If we look at what has been the biggest productivity increasing measure of the last 30 years, it has been women going back to the workforce, effectively half of the workforce going back into work and creating a huge productivity gain for our nation, and one that we don't have a similar demographic advantage into the future. So I think it is really important that we do implement the paid parental leave scheme because of that reason. It will have a big difference to our economy, and remarkably, as more people stay in work, they pay more tax. So it's a productivity increasing measure, and it's one that ultimately will pay big dividends for Australian taxpayers. In terms of the political process, you're right, it will have to go to the Senate, and I think the government will articulate the merits of this policy, and will negotiate the policy as we would with any others. And I think that we're on strong grounds. It is a good policy. I think the hindsight of history into the long term, we'll look back and we will say that this has been a great reform for our nation, and I think we're quite happy to use that as the starting point for our negotiations in the Senate.
But doesn't economic theory dictate that those productivity gains are really only there to be gained during periods of full or strong employment?
Well, and PPL helps keep people in work. So instead of staying out of, leaving the workforce when you have a child, if it gives you an incentive to come back to the workforce, you will pay more tax as you continue to earn. So I think that it is a very significant reform for our nation, and I think that we're happy to have that chat in the Senate. Let's see where the other parties and independents propose where the line might be drawn on eligibility and those things. But this is the policy we took to the election. We were elected on that mandate, and it is our intention to implement the policy as it stands.
And just finally, Wyatt, Fiona Nash, is she becoming an embarrassment for the government?
No, I don't think so. I think the Labor Party is in a pretty desperate political ploy to try and make some political wins out of this, but it's a pretty simple reality. A staffer didn't comply with the guidelines and resigned as a result, and we move on. I think that the Labor Party's sort of clutching at straws here.
But it does appear there's reports in the Fairfax media today that she still hasn't met with leading health advocacy groups like the Heart Foundation, the Cancer Council. Is it good enough this far into the government that she's willing to listen to representatives of the processed food industry, but not to those sorts of very, well-respected organisations?
Well, what I read in that report was that the health minister had met with those organisations. So, those organisations had met with the senior minister, and I thought that was appropriate. I'm sure that the minister would happily meet with those organisations, but the fact that they had a meeting with the health minister in the first place, I would have thought would have sufficed. But I think that, as I said, the Labor Party is pretty desperate here. We've taken a very small situation where a staffer had done the wrong thing and resigned, and we're trying to make a lot more out of it than is reality.
Okay, Wyatt Roy, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
We're joined now by Amanda Rishworth, the Labor MP for Kingston in South Australia. She's also the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Health. Amanda, good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
Okay, if we turn to Qantas first, does Qantas deserve government assistance? And if so, what sort of assistance?
Well, look, I think we've first got to say that the 5,000 jobs that were announced going yesterday is a really significant thing. In fact, I think it's probably one of the darkest days in our aviation history, and indeed probably one of the darkest days since the Ansett collapse. Moving forward, what do we need government to do? Well, I think government does have to have a plan. They do have to try and work with Qantas to look at how we can ensure that further jobs are protected and that we remain and continue to have a national carrier. But of course, what I'm very concerned about is that Tony Abbott has known this was down the line from the 6th of December. He's known that there was trouble in the airline. The way the government has been going around assistance for Qantas has been to put thought bubbles in the air, to provide innuendo, range of different things, no concrete plan. And so what we would like to see from the government is a concrete plan. We will look at those and work constructively, although we have drawn a line in the sand and say we believe that Qantas should remain our national carrier.
All right, Labor is saying that Qantas must remain majority Australian owned, but there are other elements of the Qantas Sales Act that may be amended, such as how much any individual foreign airline may hold and how much any particular foreign entity may hold. Are these the sort of things that Labor may be able to move on?
Oh, well, look, we've said that we will work constructively with the government, but we've had no plan from the government. We have not seen this government fight for the jobs at Qantas, and we continue to see them sit on their hands. And indeed, what we saw this week in Question Time, and indeed yesterday, is that Tony Abbott is backing away from his own suggestion of guaranteeing Qantas's debt. So what we're seeing from this government is no response, no fight in them when it comes to Australian jobs. And what we'd like to see is any proposal put forward by the government we'll have a look at, but we haven't seen anything yet. And I think that's the most concerning element of all, is that we've seen nothing from the government. They've known this was coming down the line, and we've seen no real fight in them for these jobs.
But there are plenty of ideas out and about in the public space, and one is that the government go guarantor on Qantas's debt. Is that an idea that Labor could support?
Oh, look, we'd be happy to look at whatever proposals have put forth. Of course, we've seen this as a thought bubble. Unfortunately, though, we've also seen Tony Abbott sit on his hands and tell Qantas to get the house in order before he's willing to actually look at these jobs. Of course, what we know in other circumstances, that has been code for Tony Abbott to tell management to slash wages and conditions of its workers. And I would really hope that Tony Abbott wouldn't go down the path that he did with SPC and a range of other companies, including Toyota, and that is blame the workers for this. This needs a strong government response and a response that we can work with and have a look at the detail.
Okay, if we can turn to the subject of paid parental leave, Tony Abbott was adamant in the House of Representatives on Thursday, you were there listening, that he's sticking by this scheme, but clearly there's some dissent within his own ranks. What do you think should happen? Would to your mind, would the scheme be acceptable if it was its introduction was staggered, or if it was less generous? Where are we moving on?
Well, look, firstly, what we see is that there is real disunity and division in the Liberal Party. We actually knew this when the scheme was first announced. Members such as Alex Hawke announced their concern with this. We're now seeing a momentum building of more and more backbenchers call this scheme, and indeed frontbenchers, I might add, call this scheme for what it is, and that is an unaffordable scheme. I mean, how does the government expect people to stomach a $6 co-payment when you go to the GP, your school kids bonus getting ripped off, Joe Hockey announcing that the age of entitlement is over, going to make it harder for pensioners, yet at the same time pay wealthy women $75,000 to have a baby. This is extravagantly big scheme, which is unaffordable at this time. So look, quite frankly, I think there's a lot of calls now and division in the coalition. Fortunately, Tony Abbott did this as an election stunt. This was an election stunt of Tony Abbott's, and he's now saying that it's incredibly unpopular, incredibly unaffordable, and actually really is embarrassing in the face of him trying to convince the Australian people that they've got to make all these sacrifices and cuts to their own quality of life.
Now, Amanda Ishworth, for the past couple of weeks, Labor has been pursuing the Assistant Health Minister, Fiona Nash. Just explain as simply as you can, what is it precisely that Senator Nash has done wrong?
Well, look, Senator Nash has employed or had a chief of staff who had a conflict of interest. Now, during that time he was chief of staff, we know that the star rating system, a system that is about putting front of labelling packaging on foods to tell you at a glance about how healthy they might be, that was agreed with states and territories, has been now removed, much to some of those states and territories' dismay, and certainly to the dismay of a lot of preventative health agencies that thought letting people know what's in their food and how healthy it is in an easy, understandable form is really important. Of course, so it's confusing about why Senator Nash would have pulled that down. It then came to light that her chief of staff had lobbied for the junk food industry in the past, and there were questions around whether or not he'd managed that conflict of interest. It then came to light in the Parliament that he still was a shareholder in that company, and there's now a conflict between the Prime Minister, who's saying that he was meant to get rid of those shares and he didn't, to Fiona Nash saying he'd done nothing wrong in Senate estimates. So there is a real confusion around that. It also has come to light in question time that he'd lobbied for industry assistance for Cadbury. The only seems to be the only company that is getting industry assistance from this government. So it's a very unclear about what's actually happening here and where the conflict of interest has actually affected and whether or not it's affected decision making. So there's questions to be answered. Fiona Nash has made numerous statements to the Senate about why the website was taken down. Each of these seem to conflict one another. So there are serious questions, I think, to be asked by the government.
And Fairfax is reporting that she's declined to meet or simply hasn't met with organisations like the Heart Foundation, the Cancer Council. So do you think her priorities are perhaps a little askew?
Well, look, when we hear both the Minister for Health talking about how we must reduce the cost burden on our health system, to me, prevention is better than the cure. So preventing people from becoming sick is much better than the cure. And of course, the Heart Foundation and all those organisations that you mentioned, preventative health experts, have a lot of great ideas about how we might reduce and prevent people from getting sick. And one of it is reducing the incidence of obesity. And certainly when I had a good look at the front of labelling packaging, people were saying that are time poor, they would love to be able to go into a supermarket and at a glance pick which of the items were more healthier for their families. So it seems to me very concerning when we've got this debate around cost and the costs on our healthcare system, that we're not talking prevention and that the Assistant Minister isn't meeting with prevention agencies to talk about how we reduce the burden of disease in our community.
Okay, Amanda Rishworth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was Labor's Amanda Rishworth, and before her, the Liberals' Wyatt Roy. Now, earlier I mentioned that Parliament isn't sitting today. That's only half true. The Senate and the House are not sitting, but there are a number of committees hearing around Parliament. One of the most intriguing is looking at the whole subject of drones, that is, these small helicopter-type vehicles that can fly about the place and carry cameras with them. And the committee in Parliament today is looking at the privacy issues surrounding the use of drones. To give some idea of the issues at stake here, here's a piece by Fairfax producer Nikki Majewski.
Drones are no longer a figment of sci-fi films. They're becoming the latest technology in broadcast and advertising, monitoring natural disasters, and even delivering medicine to remote locations. But what's the flip side of capturing a beautiful bird's eye view? And should we be worried?
I think that privacy is a huge concern for both the public and the industry.
New technologies are more accessible, and MPs have launched an inquiry into drone use and privacy.
There is nothing stopping your neighbour from buying a very simple toy helicopter and putting a camera on it, for example, or something like that, and spying on their neighbours.
Commercial drone operators say they have far too much to lose to deliberately invade people's privacy, and hobbyists are to blame for inappropriate drone use.
We are the ones who are targeted by the regulators, as opposed to all the hobbyists which are potentially flying into the Sydney Harbour Bridge, for example. That was done by hobbyists, or another hobbyist flying into the Sydney Airport and crashing their aircraft there.
The Civil Aviation Authority isn't responsible for privacy, but admits it's difficult to identify a drone pilot if they break the rules.
Well, of course, it is
challenging sometimes to be able to identify people who have been flying a remotely piloted aircraft or a hobby drone. In this case, we're talking about because obviously, unless you're there to see the person actually doing it, very hard to put the evidence together.
It might be just as difficult to monitor privacy, an issue that arises with many new forms of technology. Just this week, a San Francisco woman was bashed for wearing Google Glass. Privacy and new technologies not only pose a challenge for lawmakers, but also our social attitudes.
The intriguing world of drones. A parliamentary committee is investigating the issues involved. That's breaking politics for what has been a fairly hectic week in politics. We'll be back again next week when Parliament is sitting again. Until then, stay up to date with Fairfax websites and newspapers across the country. Have a great weekend.